When Sarah Martinez walked into that gleaming corporate office for the last time, she never imagined the nightmare that was about to unfold. At 37, she had built what seemed like the perfect life in Portland, Oregon. A successful marketing director at a prestigious tech company, mother of two beautiful daughters, and a woman who believed that hard work and integrity would always protect her. But sometimes, life has a way of teaching us that even the strongest among us can be broken down by those who wield power without conscience. Have you ever felt that moment when your entire world shifts beneath your feet? When everything you believed about fairness, about justice, about the basic decency of human beings suddenly crumbles? That's exactly what happened to Sarah on a rainy Tuesday morning in March when she discovered that her trusted mentor, company vice president David Richardson, had been systematically destroying her reputation behind closed doors for months. The man she had looked up to, the person who had promised to champion her career advancement, had been weaving a web of lies so intricate and devastating that it would take her years to fully understand the scope of his betrayal. The story I'm about to share with you isn't just about one woman's fight against workplace harassment and defamation. It's about the silent epidemic of professional destruction that happens to thousands of women every single day, often by people they trust most. It's about the crushing weight of public humiliation, the isolation that comes when an entire company turns against you, and the devastating impact on families when a mother's career and reputation are systematically dismantled. But more than anything, it's about the incredible strength of the human spirit and how sometimes our greatest defeats can become our most powerful victories. As I tell you Sarah's story, I want you to think about the women in your own life, your daughters, your sisters, your friends, your colleagues. Because what happened to Sarah could happen to any of us. The tactics used against her, the psychological manipulation, the way her own words were twisted and used as weapons against her, these are patterns that repeat themselves in corporate boardrooms, small businesses, and professional settings across our country every single day. Sarah had always been the type of person who believed in working within the system. She followed the rules, she was respectful to everyone regardless of their position, and she genuinely cared about helping her team succeed. For 12 years, she had built her career methodically, earning promotion after promotion through dedication and competence. She was known throughout the company as someone who could handle any crisis, someone who never lost her temper, someone who could be trusted with the most sensitive projects. Her colleagues respected her team loved working with her, and she had been on track for a senior vice president role that would have secured her family's financial future for decades. But David Richardson saw something different in Sarah. He saw a threat. As an older white man who had held power in the company for over 2 decades, he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the changing dynamics of the workplace. Sarah represented everything he felt threatened by. She was competent, well-liked, and worst of all from his perspective, she was a woman of color who was clearly more intelligent and capable than he was. So he began a campaign that started so subtly that Sarah didn't even recognize it at first. Began with small things. David would make jokes about Sarah's passion for her work, calling her a little too intense in meetings. He would question her judgment on projects she had successfully completed for years, always framing his concerns as just wanting to help her improve. He started excluding her from important meetings while telling others that she was too emotional for high-level strategic discussions. These comments, made in private conversations with other executives, began to plant seeds of doubt about Sarah's competence and professionalism. The insidious nature of David's campaign was that he never directly attacked Sarah where she could defend herself. Instead, he would have private conversations with key decision-makers, always expressing his concerns as someone who really wanted Sarah to succeed, but was worried about her readiness for senior leadership. He would point to incidents that he had either completely fabricated or deliberately misinterpreted. Passionate presentation became evidence of emotional instability. A disagreement with a vendor became proof of poor interpersonal skills. A request for additional resources became an example of unrealistic expectations. Meanwhile, to Sarah's face, David remained supportive and encouraging. He would praise her work publicly while simultaneously undermining her privately. He would give her increasingly impossible projects, setting deadlines that were unrealistic and withholding necessary resources, then expressing disappointment when she struggled to deliver perfect results under impossible circumstances. He was masterfully creating a narrative that would justify his ultimate goal, removing Sarah from any path to senior leadership and eventually from the company entirely. The psychological impact of this treatment on Sarah was devastating. She began to doubt herself in ways she never had before. She started working longer hours, trying to prove her dedication. She questioned her own memory when David would contradict things she was certain they had discussed. She found herself walking on eggshells, analyzing every word she spoke in meetings, terrified of giving David more ammunition for his whisper campaign against her. At home, Sarah's husband Marcus began to notice changes in his wife. The confident, joyful woman he had married was becoming anxious and withdrawn. She would come home from work exhausted not from productivity, but from the constant stress of navigating what felt like a minefield. She started having trouble sleeping, lying awake at night replaying conversations, wondering what she had done wrong, trying to understand why her career suddenly felt like it was slipping away despite her best efforts. Their daughters, 8-year-old Emma and 12-year-old Sophia, began to notice that their mother was different too. Sarah, who had always been fully present during family time, was now distracted and worried. She would force smiles during dinner conversations, but they could see the stress in her eyes. The family dynamic that had once been filled with laughter and warmth was becoming strained under the weight of Sarah's professional struggles. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be Sarah's greatest professional triumph. She had been working for 6 months on a major product launch that would expand the company into new international markets. It was exactly the kind of high-profile success that would have positioned her perfectly for the senior vice president role she had been working toward for years. Sarah had assembled a brilliant team, created an innovative marketing strategy, and managed to bring the project in under budget and ahead of schedule. The night before the presentation to the board of directors, Sarah stayed up until 3 in the morning putting the finishing touches on what she knew was the best work of her career. She had data showing that her strategy would increase company revenue by 30% within the first year. She had testimonials from international partners who were excited to work with them. She had everything documented and verified, knowing that this presentation would either secure her future with the company or prove once and for all that she was being deliberately sabotaged. But when Sarah arrived at the office that morning, she discovered that David had spent the previous evening having concerns about her presentation. He had convinced the CEO that the international expansion strategy was too risky and that Sarah's projections were unrealistic. Even worse, he had somehow gained access to her presentation files and had prepared his own version, taking credit for all of Sarah's innovative ideas while presenting a watered-down version that eliminated most of the elements that would have made the project successful. Standing in that conference room, watching David present her work to the board while positioning himself as the visionary leader, and her as merely an over-enthusiastic subordinate who needed better supervision, Sarah felt something break inside her. This wasn't just professional betrayal. This was the theft of her intellectual property, her career achievements, and her future. But what made it even more devastating was the way the other executives in the room nodded approvingly at David's presentation. Having been so thoroughly conditioned by his months of subtle character assassination, that they genuinely believed he was the strategic mind behind the project. After the meeting, David pulled Sarah aside with what appeared to be fatherly concern. He told her that while her enthusiasm was admirable, she needed to understand that senior leadership required a more mature approach to business strategy. He suggested that perhaps she would be happier in a role with less pressure, maybe something that would allow her to focus on the aspects of marketing she was naturally good at. The condescending tone, the implication that she had somehow failed despite delivering exactly what had been requested, the complete rewriting of history that painted him as the hero and her as a well-meaning but misguided employee, it was all too much. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life forever. She went to Human Resources to file a formal complaint against David Richardson. She had documentation of his behavior, emails that showed the timeline of his interference with her projects, and witness testimony from colleagues who had observed his pattern of undermining her authority. She believed that once the company saw the evidence, they would investigate properly and David would be held accountable for his actions. But Sarah had underestimated how deeply David's influence ran throughout the organization and how little the company valued protecting an individual employee, even a high-performing one, when it might create complications with a senior executive. Within hours of Sarah filing her complaint, word had somehow gotten back to David, and that's when his campaign against her shifted from subtle sabotage to open warfare. David began telling anyone who would listen that Sarah was a disgruntled employee who was trying to destroy his reputation because she was angry about not getting promoted. He painted her HR complaint as the desperate act of someone who was trying to avoid accountability for her own professional failures. He shared selective excerpts from her emails, taken completely out of context, to make her sound aggressive and unreasonable. He suggested that Sarah was unstable and might pose a risk to team morale if she remained with the company. The most devastating part of David's retaliation was how quickly it spread throughout the organization. Colleagues who had worked with Sarah for years and knew her character began to distance themselves from her. Not because they believed David's accusations, but because they recognized that associating with Sarah had become professionally dangerous. In corporate environments, self-preservation often outweighs loyalty, and people who might have spoken up in Sarah's defense chose instead to protect their own positions. Sarah found herself completely isolated at work. Meetings that she would normally have been included in were scheduled without her. Projects that had been assigned to her team were quietly reassigned to other departments. Her direct reports began to act awkwardly around her, clearly having been told things about their supervisor that made them uncomfortable. The professional network that Sarah had spent 12 years building seemed to evaporate overnight. The stress of the situation began to take a severe toll on Sarah's health. She started experiencing panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night with her heart racing and her mind cycling through all the ways her career was being destroyed. She lost weight from the stress, couldn't concentrate on simple tasks, and found herself constantly checking her phone for emails that might contain more bad news. Her doctor prescribed anxiety medication and suggested that she consider taking a medical leave of absence. But Sarah knew that leaving now would be seen as an admission of guilt. At home, the impact on her family was becoming impossible to ignore. Emma started having trouble in school, acting out in ways that were completely unlike her usual behavior. When Sarah and Marcus asked her what was wrong, Emma said she was worried that her mommy was sick because she cried at night and didn't smile anymore. Sophia, being older and more perceptive, asked directly if Daddy and Mommy were going to get divorced because all they did anymore was whisper about work problems when they thought the girls weren't listening. Marcus was watching the woman he loved disappear before his eyes. Sarah had always been the stronger one in their relationship, the one who could handle any crisis with grace and determination. Seeing her doubt herself, seeing her question her own memories and perceptions was agonizing for him. He wanted to march into her office and confront David Richardson directly, but Sarah begged him not to interfere, knowing it would only make things worse for her professionally. The human resources investigation that Sarah had hoped would vindicate her turned out to be a masterclass in corporate damage control. Instead of focusing on David's behavior, the investigation seemed designed to find reasons to question Sarah's credibility. They interviewed the same colleagues who had been influenced by David's Whisper campaign, naturally getting responses that supported his version of events. They reviewed email exchanges without considering the context in which they had been written. They treated Sarah's passion and dedication as evidence of emotional instability rather than professional commitment. The final report concluded that while there had been miscommunications between Sarah and David, there was no evidence of intentional harassment or discrimination. It recommended that both parties receive coaching on professional communication styles and suggested that Sarah might benefit from stress management resources. The report essentially blamed Sarah for the conflict while protecting David completely, creating an official record that would make any future legal action incredibly difficult. Reading that HR report was the moment when Sarah finally understood that she was not dealing with individual bad actors, but with an entire system designed to protect certain people while sacrificing others. The company that she had given 12 years of her life to, that had benefited enormously from her expertise and dedication, was willing to discard her completely rather than hold a senior executive accountable for his behavior. But Sarah Martinez was not the type of person to go quietly into the night. Even though the HR process had been a disappointment, she knew that she had other options. She began documenting everything more carefully, building a case that would be strong enough for external legal review. She reached out to an employment attorney who specialized in workplace harassment and discrimination cases, someone who had experience dealing with the kind of sophisticated retaliation campaigns that David had orchestrated. The attorney, Maria Gonzalez, had seen cases like Sarah's many times before. She explained to Sarah that what she was experiencing was called workplace mobbing, a systematic campaign of psychological harassment designed to force an employee to quit or create justification for termination. She told Sarah that David's tactics were actually quite common among executives who felt threatened by competent subordinates, especially women and minorities who were positioned for advancement. Maria also warned Sarah that fighting back would likely make things worse in the short term. Companies rarely admitted wrongdoing in these situations, and David would almost certainly escalate his retaliation if he felt legally threatened. But she also explained that Sarah had strong documentation and that her case had the potential to create meaningful change, not just for her, but for other employees who might face similar treatment in the future. The decision of whether to pursue legal action was incredibly difficult for Sarah. She knew it would mean enduring months or possibly years of continued harassment while the case worked its way through the system. She knew it would be expensive, stressful, and public in ways that might affect her family's privacy. She also knew that even if she won, the damage to her reputation in her industry might be permanent, making it difficult to find comparable employment elsewhere. But Sarah also knew that staying silent would mean letting David continue his behavior with other employees. She thought about the younger women in the company who looked up to her, who might face similar treatment if someone didn't take a stand. She thought about her daughters and what kind of world she wanted them to inherit. And she made the decision that even though it might cost her everything, she was going to fight back. When Sarah filed her lawsuit against the company and David Richardson personally, alleging workplace harassment, discrimination, and defamation, the response was swift and brutal. David immediately went into full defensive mode, hiring expensive attorneys and launching a public relations campaign designed to destroy what remained of Sarah's reputation. The company's legal team began an aggressive discovery process, demanding access to Sarah's personal emails, social media accounts, and medical records, looking for anything that could be used to discredit her claims. The local business press picked up the story, and suddenly Sarah found herself at the center of a very public controversy. David's version of events, carefully crafted by his legal and PR teams, painted Sarah as a vindictive former employee who was making false accusations to cover for her own professional inadequacies. Articles appeared in industry publications questioning Sarah's stability and suggesting that her lawsuit was frivolous and motivated by greed rather than genuine grievances. The social media harassment began almost immediately. Anonymous accounts began posting negative comments about Sarah on professional networking sites, questioning her competence and character. Someone created a fake LinkedIn profile using her photo and began sending inappropriate messages to her professional contacts. Her family's home address was somehow obtained and posted online, leading to unwanted attention and forcing them to consider whether they needed to move for their safety. The psychological warfare being waged against Sarah was unlike anything she could have imagined. This wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about her entire identity, her family's security, and her ability to exist in her professional community. There were days when the pressure was so intense that Sarah wondered if she should just drop the lawsuit and try to rebuild her life somewhere else, away from all the toxicity and conflict. But every time Sarah considered giving up, she would think about the other women who had reached out to her since news of her lawsuit became public. Current women from it had become a symbol of resistance against a system that protected abusers and silenced victims. The attention her case was receiving was making it impossible for other companies to ignore similar problems in their own organizations. Employment attorneys were reporting an increase in workplace harassment cases as women became more aware of their rights and more willing to fight back. The legal proceedings dragged on for 18 months, during which time Sarah had to endure depositions, interrogations, and constant scrutiny from the opposing legal team. They questioned every decision she had made, every email she had sent, every interaction she had had with colleagues over the course of her 12-year career. They brought in character witnesses to testify about David's reputation while simultaneously attacking Sarah's credibility and mental stability. The most difficult part of the process was when they deposed Sarah's family members, including her young daughters. The opposing attorneys asked Emma and Sophia questions about their mother's behavior at home, trying to establish evidence of mental instability or emotional problems. Watching her children be put through that experience nearly broke Sarah's resolve completely. No victory would be worth traumatizing her daughters, and she seriously considered settling the case just to protect them from further involvement. But then, something unexpected happened that changed the entire trajectory of the case. Former executive assistant named Jennifer Walsh came forward with information that she had been too afraid to share earlier. Jennifer had worked closely with David Richardson for 3 years before transferring to another department, and she had kept detailed records of his behavior toward female employees during that time. She had documentation of his private comments about Sarah, emails he had sent to other executives undermining female colleagues, and recordings of conversations where he explicitly discussed strategies for pushing women out of leadership positions. Jennifer's evidence was devastating to David's defense. It showed a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior that went far beyond his treatment of Sarah. It revealed that he had targeted multiple women over the years, using similar tactics of professional sabotage and reputation destruction. Most importantly, it proved that his actions had been deliberate and calculated rather than the result of personality conflicts or communication misunderstandings. The discovery of Jennifer's evidence led to a cascade of other revelations. More employees came forward with their own experiences, creating a picture of systematic discrimination that the company could no longer deny or dismiss. Internal emails surfaced showing that HR had received multiple complaints about David over the years, but had consistently failed to take meaningful action. The company's own legal team began advising settlement rather than continuing to fight a case that was becoming more damaging to their reputation every day. But even as the legal case was moving in Sarah's favor, the personal toll continued to mount. The stress of the litigation had exacerbated her health problems, leading to chronic migraines and digestive issues that required ongoing medical treatment. Her marriage, while still strong, had been strained by the constant pressure and uncertainty. Marcus had been forced to take on additional responsibilities at home while also providing emotional support for Sarah throughout the legal process. The financial impact was also significant. Even though Sarah's attorney was working on a contingency fee basis, there were still substantial costs associated with the litigation. Expert witnesses, court fees, travel expenses, and medical bills related to stress-induced health problems all added up to thousands of dollars that the family could ill afford. Sarah had been unable to find new employment during the litigation, as most companies in her industry were reluctant to hire someone involved in such a high-profile legal case. The girls, despite their parents' best efforts to shield them, were also affected by the ongoing stress and uncertainty. Emma began having nightmares and became clingy in ways that were unusual for her normally independent personality. Sophia started asking difficult questions about justice and fairness that Sarah struggled to answer honestly without making her daughter cynical about the world at such a young age. There were moments during those 18 months when Sarah questioned every decision she had made. Late at night, when she couldn't sleep because of anxiety about the next day's legal proceedings, she would wonder if she should have just accepted David's treatment and found a new job quietly. She would calculate how much money her family had spent on the lawsuit and imagine what their lives might have been like if she had chosen differently. She would worry that her decision to fight back was selfish, that she was putting her own need for justice ahead of her family's need for stability and peace. But then she would remember the moment when David presented her work to the board as his own, and the rage would return, fresh and clarifying. She would think about all the women who had reached out to share their own stories, and she would realize that her fight had become bigger than her individual grievance. She was fighting for a principle that mattered more than comfort or convenience. She was fighting for the idea that competent, hardworking women should be able to advance in their careers without having to navigate campaigns of psychological warfare from threatened male executives. The settlement negotiations began almost 2 years after Sarah had first filed her lawsuit. By that time, the company was facing multiple legal challenges related to workplace discrimination, and their insurance company was pressuring them to resolve Sarah's case rather than risk an even larger judgment at trial. David Richardson had quietly resigned from his position, ostensibly to pursue other opportunities, but actually as part of a strategy to minimize the company's liability. The final settlement amount was substantial enough to provide financial security for Sarah's family while also sending a message to other companies about the cost of tolerating discriminatory behavior. But more importantly for Sarah, the settlement included provisions that would create systemic changes in how the company handled harassment complaints and conducted performance evaluations. There would be mandatory training for all executives, an independent ombudsman to handle discrimination complaints, and regular audits of promotion decisions to identify potential bias. Sarah also negotiated for the right to speak publicly about her experience without violating the settlement agreement. This was unusual in corporate settlements, which typically include broad non-disclosure provisions. But Sarah's legal team had argued successfully that her case had become a matter of public interest that went beyond individual employment concerns. The day the settlement was finalized, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions that she had not anticipated. Relief was the strongest feeling, the sense that a massive weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders and her family could begin to rebuild their lives. There was also grief for the career she had lost, the colleagues who had abandoned her, and the innocence about workplace fairness that she would never be able to recover. There was satisfaction in knowing that David Richardson would face consequences for his behavior and that the company would be forced to implement changes that would protect future employees. But there was also sadness about the cost of achieving that victory, the toll it had taken on her family, and the recognition that even with a successful legal outcome, some damage could never be fully repaired. In the weeks following the settlement, Sarah began the difficult process of deciding what to do with the rest of her professional life. She was financially secure enough to take time to heal and consider her options. But she also knew that she needed meaningful work to feel complete. The lawsuit had revealed skills she hadn't known she possessed, particularly in research, strategic thinking, and public advocacy. She had become an expert in employment law and workplace discrimination in ways that might be valuable to other women facing similar challenges. Sarah decided to use her settlement money and newfound expertise to establish a nonprofit organization focused on supporting women who were experiencing workplace harassment and discrimination. She partnered with Maria Gonzalez and other employment attorneys to create a resource center that would provide legal advice, emotional support, and strategic guidance for women who were dealing with hostile work environments. The organization, which Sarah named Voices Rising, began as a small operation run out of her home office, but quickly grew as word spread about the services they provided. Sarah found that her experience, while traumatic, had given her unique credibility with women who were facing similar challenges. They trusted her because she had been where they were, had survived the worst that corporate retaliation could offer, and had emerged victorious despite enormous personal cost. Working with other survivors gave Sarah a sense of purpose that she had not experienced even during the most successful periods of her corporate career. Every woman they helped to document her case properly, every settlement they negotiated, every policy change they secured at a corporation felt like a small victory against the system that had tried to destroy her. She was transforming her own pain into power for others, creating meaning from what had initially felt like senseless suffering. The girls watched their mother rebuild herself in ways that they were still too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize as important. They saw her strength return, her confidence rebuild, and her smile become genuine again, rather than forced for their benefit. They began to understand, in age-appropriate ways, that their mother had fought for something important and had won. Not just for herself, but for other women who needed someone to show them that fighting back was possible. Marcus watched his wife's transformation with awe and admiration. The woman who had been nearly broken by David Richardson's campaign of harassment had emerged as a powerful advocate for justice and equality. She had taken the worst experience of her professional life and had used it to create something meaningful and lasting. Her resilience had not only impressed him, but it also taught him important lessons about courage, perseverance, and the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the cost is high. 3 years after the settlement, Sarah was invited to speak at a national conference on workplace discrimination. Standing before an audience of hundreds of women, many of whom had their own stories of harassment and retaliation, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to that moment. She talked about the darkness of those early days when she felt completely alone and powerless. She talked about the importance of documentation, legal support, and community in fighting back against discrimination. But most importantly, she talked about the possibility of transformation, of taking the worst experiences in our lives and using them to create positive change for others. As Sarah concluded her speech that day, she looked out at the faces of the women in the audience and saw her younger self reflected in their expressions. She saw the fear, the anger, the uncertainty, and the desperate hope for justice that she remembered so well from her own early days of fighting back. But she also saw something that she had not been able to see during her own darkest moments: the possibility that their struggles could become their strength, that their wounds could become their wisdom, and that their individual fights could become part of a larger movement toward equality and justice. Sarah Martinez had entered that corporate office years earlier as a successful marketing director who believed that hard work and integrity would always be enough to protect her. She left it as something much more powerful, a woman who had faced the worst that systemic discrimination could offer and had emerged not just intact, but transformed, ready to help others navigate their own journeys from victimhood to advocacy, from isolation to community, from despair to hope. Today, Sarah's story continues to inspire women across the country who are facing their own workplace challenges. Her organization has helped hundreds of women document harassment, negotiate settlements, and find the courage to fight back against discrimination. More importantly, her willingness to share her story publicly has helped to normalize conversations about workplace harassment and has encouraged other women to speak up when they experience similar treatment. The courage that Sarah showed in fighting back against David Richardson's campaign of harassment has created ripple effects that continue to expand years after her case was settled. Companies are now more aware of the legal and financial risks of tolerating discriminatory behavior. Women are more knowledgeable about their rights and more willing to document problems when they occur. And most importantly, the culture of silence that once protected abusers has begun to crack. creating space for victims to speak up and seek justice. Sarah's journey from successful executive to isolated target to powerful advocate proves that even our most painful experiences can become sources of strength and wisdom if we are willing to transform them into something meaningful. Her story reminds us that fighting back against injustice is never easy and always comes with costs, but that the alternative, remaining silent in the face of abuse, ultimately costs us even more. And her example shows us that individual acts of courage can create collective change, that one woman's willingness to stand up for herself can inspire and empower countless others to do the same. If you are facing workplace harassment, discrimination, or retaliation, Sarah's story offers both practical guidance and emotional inspiration. Document everything, seek legal advice early, build a support network, and remember that you are not alone in your struggle. The path to justice is rarely straightforward and never easy, but it is possible. And the women who have walked it before you are ready to help light the way forward. Sarah Martinez turned her greatest professional defeat into her most meaningful victory. And her journey reminds us all that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to let others define our worth, our capabilities, or our futures. Sometimes the most radical act of all is simply insisting on our right to be treated with dignity and respect and being willing to fight for that right no matter what the cost.